Rain fell in silver sheets across the cobblestones of Elderwood Manor, each droplet catching the lantern light in trembling prisms, as though the heavens themselves whispered disapproval. She stood at the wrought iron gates, her skirts clinging damply to her calves, the fabric darkened by the storm, and yet her posture betrayed a stubborn pride. Lady Eleanor, though none would dare grant her the courtesy of her name, was an anomaly in polished society, soft of cheek, round of form, and burdened with whispers that followed her like a shadow at every ball, every carriage ride, every passing glance. Tonight, the whispers had sharpened into cruelty. A carriage rumbled past, jolting puddles against her boots. From within, a cluster of young ladies leaned forward, fans trembling in hand, their smiles sharp with malice. "She dares linger at the gates?" one hissed, eyes narrowing. "Unmarried, abandoned, and so abundant," another murmured, as if her mere presence offended propriety itself. Eleanor's fingers clenched the wrought iron bars, knuckles white, yet her chest rose and fell with a fragile dignity. She had long mastered the art of appearing unaffected, though inside, shame gnawed like an unrelenting tide. The gates groaned under the push of wind, echoing the storm's mood, and Eleanor's gaze fell to the garden beyond, where lanterns swayed in the wet darkness, and roses, heavy with rain, bowed their heads as if in sympathy. Each droplet that traced the curve of a petal mirrored her own silent humiliation, the constant reminder that the world judged her body before her heart, her station before her soul. She tucked a stray lock of hair damp against her cheek, daring herself to meet the gaze of any passerby, though every glance seemed to pierce her with invisible daggers. It was then that he appeared, a figure cut from shadow and candlelight, descending the wet steps with the assurance of one accustomed to command. The Duke of Ashbourne, the most desired man in all of Elderwood, cloaked in a dark coat that shimmered with storm sheen, his eyes like polished onyx searching the night. He moved with a quiet authority, each step measured, deliberate, yet with an unspoken curiosity that seemed to carve the world into halves, those worthy of notice and those invisible. Eleanor, trembling yet unwilling to shrink, felt his gaze settle upon her. Around them, the storm and gossip fused into a living thing. Droplets hissed on cobblestones, the wind whistled through the iron spikes, and whispers of society brushed past like ghostly hands. She was exposed in every sense, seen, judged, and left dangling between humiliation and hope. And yet, there was something in the Duke's look that unsettled her. Not derision, nor pity, but a quiet calculation, as if he were weighing a secret, deciding its worth. Eleanor swallowed, a shiver racing through her spine. The lanterns flickered, casting her shadow long and trembling across the slick stone, and in that moment, the world seemed suspended. The storm, the whispers, her shame, all poised on a delicate, imperceptible balance. Then, with a sudden step forward, he closed the distance between them, the soft scrape of leather against stone announcing an approach that would shift everything. Her heart caught, breath halted, and she realized that this night, so full of rain and ruin, might yet carry a turn neither she nor society could foresee. The Duke halted a few steps before the gates, his coat soaked and clinging, dark as midnight, yet somehow luminous beneath the lantern glow. Eleanor's pulse thudded against her ribs, each beat a quiet drum of defiance and fear. He extended a gloved hand, not to touch her, but to release a small, delicate object that fluttered through the rain, a silk handkerchief embroidered with gold thread, its corners kissed with droplets. It landed at her feet, trembling slightly in the wind, as if alive with the weight of the gesture. She bent, fingers brushing the soaked silk, heart hammering with indecision. To pick it up was to acknowledge his attention. To leave it was to surrender pride. Her hand closed over the fabric with a gentle determination, lifting it as one might lift a treasure found in ruin. The Duke's eyes, dark and inscrutable, followed her every motion, and in that quiet observation, Eleanor felt a strange collision of dread and hope. She knew society would see the exchange as scandalous. Already, gossip would twist this simple act into something indecent, a proof of impropriety between a lady deemed unworthy and a man of the highest rank. From the edge of the gardens, a faint titter of laughter reached her ears, a ripple of ridicule from those who could not imagine such a union. The gossips, ever watchful, whispered behind fans and parasols, their words sharp and cruel. "He cannot desire her. Surely it is jest." Another voice hissed, "Do you see? He deigns to touch her handkerchief. Abomination!" Eleanor's cheeks burned with a mix of shame and a stubborn, rising defiance. She lifted her gaze to meet his, and in that instant, the world of judgment faded, replaced by the weight of his attention, intense and deliberate. The Duke inclined his head slightly, a subtle gesture that carried authority and curiosity, and spoke, his voice low but audible over the rain. "You have taken it well, lady," he paused, letting her fill the silence with her name, though none had yet spoken it aloud in this company. His tone was neither mocking nor dismissive, but measured, as if he were testing her mettle. Eleanor, cheeks still flushed, found herself answering with the smallest trace of defiance. "Eleanor, and I keep what falls into my hands, Duke, even in storm and scrutiny." Her words, simple yet resolute, hung between them, a fragile bridge across the gulf of expectation and societal cruelty. The Duke's expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable, a faint curve of approval, the merest acknowledgement of her dignity. Then, as if sensing the eyes that would always watch, he allowed a faint smile, almost imperceptible, a spark of humor and recognition, and took a single step back, giving her space yet commanding the scene with an unspoken power. Behind them, the storm seemed to lean closer, the wind tugging at wet skirts and coats, the rain tapping against iron and stone in a staccato rhythm that matched Eleanor's quickening pulse. The handkerchief, clenched in her fist, became more than fabric. It was a token, a message, a challenge to the world that had long scorned her. She felt the rush of audacity, a daring she had never permitted herself, coursing through her veins. To stand there, acknowledged by the Duke himself, was both terrifying and intoxicating. The gossips, sensing a development far beyond their expectation, whispered faster, voices rising like a storm within a storm. "He notices her," one hissed. "Do you see how he regards her?" Another muttered, sharp and urgent. "It cannot be propriety. No woman so, well." And here the words faltered, stifled by the audacity of the scene unfolding. The shame, the humiliation that had clung to Eleanor like damp velvet, began to shift, tinged now with an unfamiliar spark. Recognition, perhaps even power. Eleanor met the Duke's gaze again, rain streaking their faces in delicate lines, eyes locked in a silent conversation that words could scarcely contain. The storm around them seemed to pause, the night holding its breath, waiting. She sensed the careful deliberation behind his movements, the way he allowed the scandal to brush the edges of propriety without fully stepping across it. And in that pause, Eleanor understood. This simple act, this handkerchief, was not merely a token. It was a declaration, subtle and perilous, that her life was poised to change. A carriage wheel clattered against the wet stones behind them, the noise slicing through the charged air, and the Duke's eyes flicked toward it for the briefest moment. Then, with deliberate calm, he stepped closer, the rain forming rivulets along his coat, and murmured, almost conspiratorially, "Shall we walk, Lady Eleanor? There is more to see than what the eyes of gossip permit." Her breath caught. The offer, simple yet daring, trembled with promise, and Eleanor felt the precarious edge of her world tilt. The storm would not cease, nor would society's scrutiny, but perhaps, just perhaps, a different course, one of audacity and unexpected connection, had begun. The garden behind Elderwood Manor was a sanctuary of shadow and silver, the storm's fury reduced here to gentle rivulets on rose petals and the soft murmur of wind through ancient yews. Lanterns, strategically hung, flickered like fragile stars against the darkness, casting pools of light on the wet paths where Eleanor's skirts brushed the cobblestones. She walked beside the Duke, his presence a dark and solid rhythm at her side, neither too near nor distant, a tension she could feel as acutely as the cold rain dripping from her hair. The handkerchief he had dropped into her possession rested carefully folded in her palm, a symbol heavy with expectation she dared not yet name aloud. For a long moment, neither spoke, and the quiet seemed to stretch into eternity, broken only by the soft squelch of wet shoes on stone. Eleanor's thoughts swirled in the storm's echo, society's jeers, the cruel whispering of ladies who measured worth in the delicate balance of silk and waistlines, and the hollow ache of a pride perpetually bruised. Her heart, though, dared to leap at the Duke's silent acknowledgment, at the way his presence suggested that the world need not dictate the measure of her worth. Finally, he spoke, low and deliberate, his voice carrying the weight of command, yet softened by intimacy. "You bear yourself with remarkable restraint, Lady Eleanor. I have observed countless women who would crumble beneath scrutiny, yet you do not bow, even under the storm." The words, polite and measured, were unlike the whisper she had grown accustomed to, piercing through her shame with a warmth that was almost alarming. She felt a blush climb, a mixture of embarrassment and a thrill she did not dare name, and yet she forced her gaze to meet his. "I have learned," she replied carefully, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt beneath the surface, "that dignity is a garment one must weave from one's own hands, regardless of the world's scorn." The Duke's lips curved in a faint, approving smile, and he inclined his head, eyes darkening with what seemed to be contemplation rather than judgment. Eleanor's chest tightened. There was something in his scrutiny that felt less like examination and more like discovery, a measured weighing of a soul rather than a body, of courage rather than charm. They reached a small terrace, the stone wet beneath their feet, roses dripping with rain at the edges. The Duke gestured toward a bench beneath an arched trellis, vines slick and glimmering, and Eleanor seated herself, folding her damp skirts neatly. He remained standing, one hand resting lightly on the trellis, and she could not escape the way the lanterns caught the sharp angles of his face, the way shadow and light played across features that were at once commanding and subtly vulnerable. She felt exposed yet curiously protected, the paradox gnawing at her chest. "I must confess," the Duke began, voice low, almost a whisper carried only between them, "that society's gaze has never held meaning for me as it does for others. I have admired masks, dances, and etiquette, yet all these are but illusions if the heart is neglected." Eleanor's fingers tightened around the handkerchief. She sensed a tremor of vulnerability beneath his composed exterior, a hint that his world of wealth, privilege, and expectation had its own prisons. For the first time, she saw not the Duke the town adored, but the man beneath, the one capable of longing, of solitude, of the quiet ache that mirrored her own. She exhaled slowly, the tension coiling in her chest, loosening by the fraction of an inch. "And what of the heart that dares to hope, even when the world is certain it will break?" she asked, the words trembling despite her effort at poise. His eyes, so dark they seemed to absorb the lantern light, softened imperceptibly. He stepped closer, bridging the space between them without touching, yet his presence pressed against her like gravity. Then he said, "It is not hope that is reckless, but those who deny its existence." And yet, he paused, gaze flicking momentarily to the dripping roses before returning. "Hope requires courage. Courage, Lady Eleanor, that I find rare indeed." Her throat tightened. She had lived her life beneath the scrutiny of a society cruel in its judgments, where each smile could mask disdain, each compliment could carry mockery. Yet here, in the hush of lantern-lit rain and whispered wind, she felt the weight of her fear loosen, replaced by a tentative thrill that dared to imagine recognition, even love, beyond her form and past. The Duke's presence, the cadence of his voice, the small, deliberate ways he allowed her to hold her dignity. It was a revelation she could scarcely name, yet it stirred every hidden longing in her chest. "Do you truly see me?" she whispered, voice almost lost to the wind and rain. Not the ridicule, not the gossip, but me? His eyes held hers, unwavering, and for a long heartbeat, the world seemed to vanish. No gates, no jeers, no storm. Only the fragile, trembling possibility of understanding. "I do," he said at last, voice threaded with quiet conviction. "I see the woman who has endured, who has risen despite the weight of scorn, and I admire her entirely." The words struck her with the force of revelation, and tears, unbidden, pricked her lashes. She blinked them away, a mixture of relief, disbelief, and a warmth that was wholly unfamiliar. In that instant, the storm seemed less an enemy and more a witness, the wind and rain applauding in hushed symphony as if the world itself acknowledged her rare triumph. To be seen, truly, for the first time. A soft breeze rustled the vines overhead, carrying with it the scent of wet roses and a quiet promise of change. The Duke stepped even closer, so that only the smallest space remained between them, and murmured, "There's more to say, Lady Eleanor, and yet the night permits us but whispers. Tomorrow, perhaps, we shall explore what must be spoken aloud." Eleanor's heart skipped. The implication hung between them, delicate and electrifying. The handkerchief, once a token of attention, now seemed to pulse in her grasp, a promise of a future neither expected nor feared entirely, yet one that could alter everything. The ballroom of Elderwood Manor gleamed under 1,000 flickering candles, each flame reflected in polished floors and crystal chandeliers, scattering prisms of light like shards of frozen fire. Musicians, stationed in a corner beneath an arch of roses still dripping with storm's remnants, played a soft waltz, the notes weaving through the hushed murmurs of the assembly. Society's elite, ladies in silken gowns and men in tailored coats, gathered with eyes sharp, fans fluttering like wings of judgment. Eleanor moved through the hall with careful poise, skirts trailing lightly across the marble. Each step measured against the whispers and sidelong glances that followed her. She felt the weight of eyes like stones, their silent derision pressing against the fragile walls of her dignity. From the gallery, the Duke observed. His gaze, dark and commanding, swept over the assembly with a quiet authority, noting the subtle stares aimed at Eleanor, the twitching of gloves and fans, the veiled sneers hidden behind polite smiles. He had chosen this evening deliberately, for the hall offered both spectacle and discretion. Public enough for society to witness, private enough for his intention to remain unmistakably clear to her. Eleanor's heart fluttered in anticipation she did not dare name aloud, a mixture of fear and exhilaration that left her trembling beneath the fine lace of her gown. A rustle of silk, the soft click of polished boots, and the Duke descended the steps from the gallery, each movement deliberate, magnetic, drawing the attention of all present without effort. Whispers erupted immediately, a chorus of disbelief. Is he approaching her? And it cannot be propriety. Eleanor's cheeks warmed, but she lifted her chin, folding her hands delicately, meeting his approach with measured composure. Every eye turned, every heart racing with curiosity, yet she held herself with the dignity of one who had long learned to endure. When he reached her, the music softened slightly, as though the orchestra itself acknowledged the significance of the moment. The Duke extended a gloved hand, not to touch her directly, but to invite her into the space between them, commanding yet deferential. "Lady Eleanor," he began, voice low and rich, carrying effortlessly across the hushed hall, "I must speak plainly, though society's gaze is upon us. I have long observed the customs, the dances, the polite pretenses, and found them hollow when weighed against truth. And here," he gestured subtly toward her, "I find truth itself embodied." A collective gasp spread through the hall. Eleanor's pulse quickened, and she felt the tug of both fear and exhilaration. To hear such words in the open was to court scandal, yet there was no mockery in his tone, only conviction, a rare and dangerous honesty. She raised her eyes to meet his, and in the depths of those onyx shadows, She saw not only admiration, but a fervent intent, an unyielding promise that society's whispers would not sway him. The murmurs of the assembly swelled, voices straining to catch meaning, but the Duke's presence and tone commanded silence. "I will not defer to the judgment of gossip," he continued, stepping closer, his figure cutting a dark, elegant silhouette against the candlelight. "I will not barter affection for conformity, nor shall I allow cruelty to dictate matters of the heart. Lady Eleanor," and here his eyes held hers with a gravity that made the world fall away, "if you will consent, I ask that you join me in marriage, that we face both the world and its scorn together as equals and partners in life." Eleanor's breath caught, tears threatening to spill, a tumultuous surge of relief, disbelief, and joy racking her chest. She had lived long enough to feel invisible, judged for form rather than character, dismissed for society's arbitrary measures of beauty. Yet here, before the eyes of the very world that had scorned her, she felt herself seen, not merely observed, but recognized, honored, and desired. Her lips trembled, but she found her voice, clear and unwavering despite the storm of emotion. "Yes," she whispered, "if you shall have me, then I shall join you, not as a shadow of expectation, but as myself, wholly, without disguise or fear." A hush fell across the ballroom. Even the music seemed to pause, the notes suspended midair, as though the world itself exhaled in recognition of a triumph over judgment. Some guests blinked, disbelief etched across delicate faces. Others muttered behind hands, scandalized yet unable to tear their attention away. The Duke offered his arm, and Eleanor took it, each movement deliberate, a quiet assertion that she was no longer merely a target of ridicule, but a woman acknowledged in her full, undeniable presence. As they began to move, the first tentative steps of a waltz whispered across the floor, a dance not merely of feet, but of recognition, courage, and shared resolve. Each turn, each measured pace, reinforced the unspoken pact that society's judgment could not penetrate the bond forged here, under lanterns, beneath the gaze of those who would oppose them. Eleanor felt her heart expand with a joy she had never dared imagine, tempered by the awareness that the world beyond these walls would not yield without continued defiance. The Duke leaned slightly, voiced a conspiratorial murmur that brushed against her ear, intimate despite the crowd. "We have begun, Lady Eleanor, but the night is far from spent. There will be whispers, there will be scrutiny, yet I am resolved." She shivered at the weight of his words, a mixture of anticipation and the delicate thrill of danger. His hand, steady and certain, guided her through the space as if the ballroom itself were theirs alone, and she dared at last to imagine a life unbound from shame and limitation. Outside, the rain had ceased, leaving only the faint scent of wet stone and roses, a reminder of the storm they had already endured. Within, the assembly would chatter, speculate, and perhaps condemn, but Eleanor and the Duke moved as though impervious, a single current of courage and conviction threading between them. Every glance, every measured step, every subtle touch of gloved hands upon hers reinforced the truth they had begun to carve, that love, when claimed boldly, could defy even the most rigid expectations. And yet, as the last strains of music swelled around them, a subtle tension remained, a whisper that not all eyes were idle, that society's judgment would not vanish entirely, and that their union, while declared, had only begun its delicate negotiation with the world outside. Eleanor felt it, a pulse of uncertainty beneath her triumph, and in the dark depths of the Duke's eyes, she sensed he, too, perceived the challenges yet to come. Still, the first step had been taken, and the night, for all its grandeur and peril, shimmered with possibility. The manor gates, now gleaming beneath the first pale light of dawn, bore witness to a scene that would ripple through Elderwood society for months to come. Rain from the previous night lingered in puddles, reflecting the delicate pink and gold of morning, and the air carried the soft, lingering scent of wet roses. Eleanor stood at the threshold, the folds of her gown damp yet glimmering like spun silk, her hands clasped before her as if holding together the courage that had carried her from whispered scandal to this defining moment. Around her, servants moved silently, aware that today was no ordinary morning, that the world itself seemed to pause in anticipation. The Duke approached from the carriage, every step deliberate, measured, as though the earth itself had bent to his will. His coat, dark as midnight, yet catching the first light, clung to him, the storm of yesterday a distant echo upon the polished leather of boots and gloved hands. Eleanor's breath caught at the sight of him, and for a heartbeat, all the judgments, all the whispers, all the cruel voices that had marked her life faded to silence. Here, in the quiet gold of dawn, she was not a target of ridicule, not a shadow of societal expectation, but a woman fully recognized, fully seen, and fully desired. He halted before her, the carriage wheels creaking softly in the stillness, and inclined his head with a gravity that demanded attention. "Eleanor," he said, voice low and resonant, carrying the weight of all he had held back and all he now intended to declare. "This day is ours, unclaimed by scandal, unshadowed by gossip. Will you join me, not as the world dictates, but as your heart desires?" Eleanor's lips trembled, caught between disbelief and hope, between the lingering echoes of shame and the blazing certainty of this moment. She felt the years of whispered judgment, the nights of silent despair, all melt away beneath the strength of his gaze. "Yes," she whispered, voice steady at last. "I will with all that I am, with every fragment of courage that has brought me here. I am yours, as you are mine, unyielding and undiminished." The Duke's eyes softened, dark onyx pools reflecting awe and tenderness, and he extended his hand fully, palm open, offering not just guidance, but partnership, equality, and trust. Eleanor placed her hand in his, feeling the warmth and solidity that matched the certainty of her own resolve. Around them, the manor seemed to exhale, the echo of rustling leaves and distant birdsong marking a world that had paused long enough to recognize the triumph of authenticity over pretense. A hush fell over the garden as onlookers emerged. Family, servants, and a few discreet neighbors drawn by curiosity and the news of the Duke's intentions. The whispers began, tentative and questioning, but Eleanor did not flinch. She walked beside the Duke, her head held high, shoulders squared against the scrutiny that had haunted her all life. Each step became a declaration that beauty was not measured in form alone, that worth was not weighed by social expectation, and that love, when claimed boldly, could defy even the harshest judgment. The ceremony itself was simple, intimate, a private acknowledgement of vows more binding than society's rules. Beneath a wrought iron arch entwined with roses dripping dew, the Duke and Eleanor exchanged words measured, deliberate, and yet trembling with emotion. His voice carried the weight of sincerity. "I pledge to honor, to protect, and to see you in all your brilliance, unshadowed by the world's eyes, forever." Eleanor's reply, equally steady and heartfelt, mirrored his devotion. "I pledge to stand beside you, to share all burdens, all triumphs, and to love you beyond the whispers of judgment." A gentle breeze stirred the vines above, carrying with it the scent of roses and rain, and the faint sound of water trickling from leaves punctuated the solemnity of their words. Their hands, clasped firmly, became symbols of resilience, courage, and an unbreakable bond forged in the crucible of societal cruelty and private longing. Around them, the first rays of sun pierced the clouds, bathing the garden in a golden glow that seemed to sanctify the union, a visual testament to hope rising from the ashes of humiliation. The Duke, sensing the lingering tension in Eleanor's expression, leaned closer, his voice a conspiratorial whisper against her ear. "The world may gaze, Eleanor, but it cannot touch what is ours." She shivered, not from cold, but from the raw intimacy of being recognized fully, acknowledged without pretense, loved without reservation. The promise of their shared life, both daunting and exhilarating, stretched before them like a sun-drenched path through the morning mist. Their first steps together as husband and wife carried a weight far heavier than mere ceremony. Each movement was deliberate, a ballet of assertion and tenderness. The Duke guided Eleanor through the garden, past fountains where droplets glimmered like diamonds in the dawn, past flower beds still wet with storm, and finally to the steps of the manor where society awaited, curious and cautious. Faces turned as they appeared, expressions flickering between astonishment and tentative admiration. Yet neither Eleanor nor the Duke faltered. They moved as one, united, the years of judgment rendered impotent by the undeniable force of their union. In the eyes of the crowd, Eleanor glimpsed the recognition she had always longed for. Not mockery, not ridicule, but tempered with disbelief. She felt a surge of pride, not merely in her beauty, nor in the Duke's choice, but in her own strength, in the courage that had carried her from the cold isolation of manor gates to the warmth of recognition, love, and partnership. Every whispered judgment, every cruel glance of the past had been transformed into a triumph of perseverance and dignity. The Duke, sensing the final thread of hesitation in her posture, pressed her hand gently, whispering, "We have weathered storms unseen and storms known. Yet here at last the dawn belongs to us." Eleanor's heart swelled. The weight of all she had endured, all she had feared, fell away beneath the promise of life unshadowed by scorn. Their steps carried them across the threshold, out of the garden and into the manor, where the doors closed softly behind them, separating the warmth of love from the cold judgment of the world. For a moment, all was still. The garden lay in quiet splendor, dew-laden petals trembling in the soft breeze, lanterns extinguished, the storm of the previous night a memory reflected in puddles that now mirrored the gentle light of morning. Eleanor and the Duke paused within the doorway, hands clasped, faces close, breathing together as if synchronizing with the heartbeat of the world itself. The hardships endured, the whispers, the ridicule, all paled in the brilliance of the triumph they now shared. A soft laugh, tentative yet joyous, escaped Eleanor's lips, the sound carrying with it release, relief, and the delicate thrill of recognition fully granted. The Duke mirrored her expression, a rare softness illuminating his otherwise commanding features. And in that look, they acknowledged the truth of what had been accomplished. Love, in its purest form, had claimed victory over shame, society, and fear. And as the sun fully rose, bathing Elderwood Manor in golden light, Eleanor realized that the storm had not ended. It had merely shifted. They had weathered judgment, scandal, and doubt, but the world beyond the gates remained as watchful and fickle as ever. Yet, for the first time, she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, fortified by love, courage, and the unshakable conviction that the heart's truth could triumph where appearances had failed. With a final, deliberate glance at the garden, Eleanor allowed herself to smile, a luminous, unguarded expression, knowing that the path forward would require vigilance, yet promised joy unlike any she had ever dared imagine. The Duke's hand tightened gently around hers, a silent affirmation of the journey they had begun and the life that awaited beyond the scrutiny of those who had once doubted them. And in that golden morning, the storm's memory lingered only to remind them of how far they had come, and of the brilliance yet to unfold.